For 11 seasons, millions of people laughed at a family that had absolutely nothing going for them. No money, no romance, no respect for each other. And somehow that was the whole appeal. Married with Children turned misery into comedy. And at the center of it stood one man in a recliner, complaining about his shoes, his wife, his kids, and his life. But what most viewers never understood is that the joke they were laughing at was closer to truth than anyone behind the camera wanted to admit. And it took Ed O'Neill decades to finally say it out loud. This is a story of what he exposed, what the cast hid, and why the show that critics hated became one of the most quietly influential sitcoms in television history. When Married with Children premiered in the spring of 1987, it wasn't just a new show, it was a statement. Fox was a brand new network trying to find its footing, and instead of copying the warm, less-of-the-week formula that dominated network television at the time, the creators built something that mocked that formula on purpose. The idea was simple on paper. Take everything that made a sitcom family lovable and reverse it. Where other shows had parents who solved problems with a hug, the Bundys solved nothing and hugged even less. Where other shows ended with a moral, this one ended with somebody getting humiliated. That approach terrified some of the network's own executives before it ever aired, because nobody could guarantee an audience would want to spend 30 minutes a week with people this unpleasant. The strange part is that audiences did want exactly that, and they wanted it badly. Within a couple of seasons, Married with Children wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, becoming appointment viewing for people who felt like traditional sitcom families didn't look anything like their own lives. Al Bundy wasn't a wise, patient father figure. He was bitter, broke, and stuck in a job he despised, selling shoes to customers he couldn't stand. Peggy wasn't a nurturing homemaker. She spent Al's money, refused to cook or clean, and treated marriage like a punishment she was serving out. Kelly and Bud weren't earnest kids learning valuable lessons. They were selfish, combative, and constantly scheming against each other. On paper, it sounds like a show nobody should have wanted to watch. In practice, it became one of the defining sitcoms of its era, precisely because it refused to pretend that family life was easy or admirable. That contradiction is the first thing Ed O'Neill eventually admitted fans never fully grasped. People loved watching Al Bundy suffer, loved quoting his complaints, loved the show's rhythm of insult after insult. But according to O'Neill, almost nobody ever said the one thing that would have made the show land differently, that they saw themselves in him. In interviews later in his life, O'Neill reflected on just how often fans would stop him in public, decades after the show ended, and tell him the character reminded them of someone, their uncle, their brother, their father, almost never themselves. It became something of a running joke to him, because the whole premise of Al Bundy only worked if he represented something universal about frustration, disappointment, and the grinding monotony of working-class life. Yet the audience kept the character at arm's length, laughing at him as a caricature of somebody else rather than admitting the character's frustrations mirrored their own. That gap between what the show was actually about and how audiences chose to receive it is part of what makes Married with Children more interesting in hindsight than it seemed at the time. Critics in 1987 largely dismissed it as crude and shallow. Reviews from major papers called it loud, vulgar, and lowbrow, comparing it unfavorably to earlier working-class sitcoms that had at least attempted some warmth underneath the jokes. What those reviews missed, and what O'Neill has pointed out more directly in recent years, is that the show was never trying to be warm. It was building a version of the American family sitcom that had given up on aspiration entirely. The Bundys weren't trying to climb out of their situation. They were fully aware they were stuck, and the comedy came from how loudly and shamelessly they admitted it. That was the joke critics didn't get. And in a strange way, it was also the joke a large part of the audience didn't fully sit with either. They enjoyed the show as an exaggerated cartoon rather than recognizing it as social commentary wrapped in a laugh track. O'Neill has also been candid about how little respect the show earned within the industry, even at the height of its popularity. Despite running for over a decade and becoming one of the most recognizable comedies on television, Married with Children never collected major industry accolades, and O'Neill has said plainly that the show was a commercial success without ever becoming a critical darling among his peers. That disconnect mattered to him more than casual fans probably realized. He wasn't just playing a beloved character for millions of viewers. He was doing so while sensing that many people in his own profession looked down on the work. It's a strange position for an actor to be in, adored by an audience of tens of millions, quoted constantly, recognized everywhere he went, and still treated as though the show itself was something to be a little embarrassed about in more serious entertainment circles. That tension between public love and industry dismissal shaped much of what happened behind the scenes, and it's part of why so many of the show's internal stories only came out years later. For a long time, the public image of the cast was that they functioned like an unusually close, if chaotic, television family. The truth, according to more recent interviews from the people who lived it, was considerably more complicated. Katie Sagal, who played Peggy, has described the atmosphere on set as sharp-tongued and unforgiving, the kind of environment where turning your back for even a moment meant becoming the target of the next joke. Christina Applegate, who played Kelly, backed up that description with her own memories of overhearing cast and crew members talking about her the moment she left a room, something that stuck with her long after the show ended. It wasn't the picture most fans imagined when they watched the family bicker affectionately on screen. For Applegate specifically, the pressure of the role went much deeper than office gossip. She has spoken about how being cast as the show's sex symbol at an extremely young age created a kind of psychological weight that followed her for years. The wardrobe choices that became so iconic for Kelly Bundy, the short skirts and tight outfits that defined the character's look, came with a level of scrutiny that a teenager should never have had to carry. Applegate has since acknowledged that the environment contributed to a serious and prolonged struggle with disordered eating, something she kept hidden from almost everyone around her at the time. She has described going out her way to eat privately, away from cast and crew, out of fear that being seen eating would somehow confirm insecurities she was already carrying about her body and her public image. It's a sobering detail to sit with, especially for anyone who only remembers Kelly Bundy as the show's punchline about vanity and ditziness. The character got laughs. The actor playing her was quietly struggling in ways audiences had no way of knowing about. What makes this part of the story especially striking is that Applegate herself was responsible for much of what made Kelly memorable in the first place. The character wasn't originally envisioned the way fans remember her. Early plans for Kelly leaned toward a tougher, more rebellious biker-type persona, closer to a stereotypical rock and roll rebel than the ditzy, hyper-glamorous teenager who became a pop culture fixture. Applegate has talked about pushing back on that direction and pitching something different, drawing inspiration from the exaggerated rock video aesthetic of the era, big hair, tight clothing, and over-the-top glamour that mirrored the music videos and metal culture she found fascinating at the time. It was her creative instinct that shaped Kelly into the character audiences fell for, which makes it even more complicated that the same choices she championed also became the source of years of unwanted scrutiny and personal pain. The show's internal culture wasn't only hard on Applegate. O'Neill himself has acknowledged, particularly in interviews later in his career, that his relationships with castmates weren't always the friendly, easygoing dynamic fans assumed. He's spoken candidly about a falling out with Amanda Burse, who played neighbor Marcy, that stemmed from a disagreement during a magazine cover shoot years into the show's run. When only a limited number of cast members were selected to appear on the cover, some of the actors who were left off expected O'Neill, as the show's lead, to push back on their behalf. He didn't. He has said he was blunt about it at the time, telling them directly that he wasn't going to fight the decision, and that he felt lucky the show was getting that kind of attention at all. In hindsight, he's admitted he could have handled the moment with more tact, even if his answer likely would have stayed the same. That single disagreement created friction that lingered between him and Burse for years afterward, a reminder that the show's off-screen relationships weren't immune to the same pettiness and grudges the Bundys displayed every week on camera. Even the way the series ended reflected how disconnected the cast sometimes felt from the business side of the show they had spent over a decade building. O'Neill has described learning that Married with Children had been canceled not from a producer, not from a network, but essentially by accident, hearing it secondhand while away from production entirely. Applegate has told a similar story, saying she found out through a chain of people rather than any kind of direct communication from the studio. For a series that ran for 11 seasons and became one of the most talked about comedies of its decade, there was no formal send-off, no personal acknowledgement from a network to the people who had carried the show for that long. O'Neill has even joked about the absence of any kind of parting gift, comparing it to other long-running series where the cast received meaningful gestures at the end of their run. For Married with Children, there was nothing like that, just a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion to a show that had been anything but quiet for 11 years. That contrast between the show's massive cultural footprint and the way its ending was handled says something about how the industry viewed it the entire time. It was popular enough to run over 250 episodes, to spawn spin-off attempts, to remain in syndication for decades, and to become one of the defining images of Fox's early identity as a network willing to take risks other broadcasters wouldn't touch. And yet, internally, it was treated by some executives as disposable, a hit that made money, but didn't need to be honored the way more prestigious programming might have been. That disconnect between commercial success and institutional respect is part of what O'Neill seems to be pointing at when he talks about fans never quite recognizing themselves in Al Bundy. The show was underestimated from multiple directions at once. By critics who dismissed its humor as cheap, by executives who treated its ending as an afterthought, and by audiences who loved the character without ever admitting how familiar his frustrations actually were. Looking back at the show today, decades removed from its original run, it's easier to see Married with Children as something more layered than the crude, throwaway sitcom critics originally described. It was a show willing to depict a family that had already given up on a version of the American dream most sitcoms were still selling, and it did so with a bluntness that made a lot of people uncomfortable in 1987. The discomfort was the point. Al Bundy's constant complaints about his job, his marriage, and his finances weren't just jokes designed to get a laugh. They were an exaggerated mirror held up to a very real kind of exhaustion that plenty of working people recognized but rarely saw represented on screen, let alone played for comedy. The show gave voice to that frustration in a way that felt almost rebellious for network television at the time, and it did so while still delivering big laughs every single week. None of that context excuses the parts of the production that clearly took a toll on the people involved. Applegate's private struggle with disordered eating, the sharp and sometimes cruel atmosphere on set that Seagal has described, the years-long rift between O'Neill and Burse, the cold and impersonal way the cast learned their show was ending, all of it paints a picture of production that succeeded in front of the camera while leaving real scars behind it. Fans who only knew the finished episodes had no way of seeing any of that. They saw a family that screamed at each other and somehow still showed up for one another when it counted, a formula that made the show feel oddly honest even at its most exaggerated. What they didn't see was the toll that formula took on the actual people delivering those lines week after week for over a decade. Ed O'Neill's reflections on the show in the years since it ended aren't bitter, exactly, but they carry the weight of someone who spent a long time being underestimated for playing a character people loved without ever wanting to admit why. He built one of the most recognizable performances in sitcom history, sustained it across more than 250 episodes, and helped launch an entire network's identity in the process, all while sensing that his own industry considered the work beneath serious recognition. That's the quiet exposure at the heart of his more recent comments. Not a scandal, not a secret plot twist, but a simple, uncomfortable truth about how audiences and industry insiders alike misjudged what Married with Children actually was. It wasn't just a crude joke about a miserable family. It was a mirror nobody wanted to admit they were looking into, and the man in the recliner knew it the entire time. What still lingers, all these years later, is a question of how differently the show might be remembered if audiences back then had been willing to sit with that discomfort instead of laughing it off. Would Married with Children have been treated with more critical respect if viewers had openly admitted how much of Al Bundy's frustration felt familiar? Would the atmosphere on set have been less combative if the cast had felt more supported by a network that seemed to treat the show as disposable even while banking its success? Those questions don't have clean answers, but they're worth sitting with the next time an old episode comes on and gets an easy laugh. Behind that laugh was a group of people navigating real pressure, real pain, and real professional disrespect, all in service of a show that most fans loved without ever fully understanding what it was actually saying about